Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, viewers, wherever you are located. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi warmly welcomes you to the launch of our virtual book talk series, which will be focused primarily on African literature by African authors. Today, we are delighted to host Dr. Peter Kimani, where we'll be discussing one of his books, Dance of the Jakaranda. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi is part of 9 global centers positioned around the world by Columbia University. The centers serve as platforms for dialogue and the exchange of knowledge in research, education, as well as public programming. It's our hope that readers and authors who are present here today will find this series both beneficial and intriguing. Our moderator this evening will be Dr. Mshai Mwangola. Dr. Mwangola is an oratorist stroke performance scholar who uses the lens of culture in her work as an academic, artist, and activist. She holds a doctorate in performance studies from Northwestern University, USA, a Master's of Creative Arts from the University of Melbourne, Australia, and a Bachelor of Education from Kenyatta University. Dr. Mwangola chairs the board of Uriah Trust, which is the biggest non-state facilitator of civic education in Kenya. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Council of the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. She is also a founder member of the intellectual collectives, The Elephant, and the Orature Collective. Through the latter's artistic arm, the Performance Collective, she co-facilitates the monthly Point Zero Book Cafe, which features public performances and conversations around literature. This series has been organized in collaboration with Mike Mburu, a book distributor and a book enthusiast. This webinar will be recorded and can be accessed on our YouTube page as well as on our website under videos in the coming week. To ensure your safety, some features have been disabled, these being audio and video sharing, as well as screen share. You are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The moderator will tackle your questions at the end of the session. For more engaging programs, please subscribe to our mailing list by visiting our Contact Us page on our website, globalcenters.columbia.edu/Nairobi. I would now like to hand over to our moderator, Dr. Mshai Mwangola. Welcome, Dr. Mwangola.
Thank you very, very much. It is such a joy and a privilege to be able to be the one who gets to sit and have this conversation with Peter Kimani. Peter is one of my absolute favorite Kenyan writers, and that's saying a lot because we do have a whole number of them and who I know you will be getting to meet in this series. Before I say anything to Peter and before we launch into our exploration, why don't we start by just getting a sense, a touch, a feel of his writing. This is from the first few lines of Dance of the Jakaranda. Prologue. In that year, the glowworms in the marshes replaced by light bulbs. Villagers were roused out of their hamlets by a massive rumbling that many mistook for seismic shifts of the earth. These were not uncommon occurrences. Locals experienced earthquakes across the Rift Valley so often they even had an explanation for it. They said it was God taking a walk in his universe. They believed this without needing to see it. But on that day, the villagers saw the source of the noise as well. It was a monstrous, snake-like creature whose black head, erect like a cobra's, pulled rusty brown boxes and slithered down the savannah, coughing spasmodically as it emitted blue-black smoke. The villagers clasped their hands and wailed, "Yuki! Come and see the strips of iron that those strange men planted seasons earlier, which, left undisturbed, had grown into a monster gliding through the land." The gigantic snake was a train, and the year was 1901, an age where white men were still discovering the world for their kings and queens in faraway lands. So, when the railway superintendent, or simply master, as he was known to many, peered out of the window of his first-class cabin that misty morning, his mind did not register the dazzled villagers who dropped their hoes and took off or led their herds away from the grazing fields in sheer terror of that strange creature cutting through their land. Neither did Master share in the tamasha booming from across the coaches, where the British, Indian, and African workers, all in their respective compartments, were celebrating the train's maiden voyage. Instead, Master was absorbed by the landscape that looked remarkably different from how he remembered it from his previous trip. Peter, what a lovely way to start us off on the conversation. One reason I absolutely love this passage is that right at the beginning, you take us from the world and you plunge us into this other new world. And I just loved it. And immediately I know what this is about. So if I was to give you just a capsule, just to explain to me in 2 or 3 words, what is this book about? In 2 or 3 lines. 2 or 3 words would be really difficult.
I was going to say that's going to be a point. That's going to be a haiku.
It would be a haiku.
Well, I should start by saying how wonderful it is, Mshai, to reconnect. Earlier I was observing you moderated our launch early in the year, and you are moderating possibly my last talk this year. So you've been a prominent feature in my artistic life, and I appreciate you very much.
Joy,
and your performance, of course. I was already getting lost in that reverie, not just how I wrote those words and when I wrote those words, but how they sounded to me now. There was a fresh feel to them, so thank you. So you are right in that the opening few lines encapsulate the spirit of the entire book. I think that's true of virtually every memorable work of art I've read. The writer has to get the reader in, but also hint at what this book is about or shall be about. So that introduction does mark what the book shall be about. Shall be about race. There is also the railway, both metaphorical and literal construction of the railway. It's going to be about colonization, because you have those officials already emerging to direct how the train is going. So you can also tell from that opening passage that the book is also not linear. Although the train construction is linear, there are cyclical motions that imitate oral performance, and I'm glad you're performing literally. So the structure of the book, the thematic concerns, the characters as well, in a sense, have to be embodied in those few opening passages to get the reader in the direction of the story.
And I'm going to come now and we're going to go in and delve into the book, but I just wanted us to get a feel. And I love the way you've described the book, because in some ways, if somebody reads Dance of the Jacaranda, they're already getting a feel of your writing in general. And I know, Peter, before we come to the book, that yes, I think most people know you as a novelist, but you've also done quite a bit of other writing. I don't know, as was mentioned, you're a journalist. And and so as a way of introducing you to everybody, as a way of getting everybody getting to know you a little bit, could you tell me a little bit more about that part of your life, that you're a journalist, you're also an academic, and so you're teaching journalism even as you are practicing journalism. And I think when we come to Dance of the Jacaranda, one of the things I really love about the book is your eye for detail. It's the way you, even though you're telling us a story and we get caught up in the characters, and we'll come back to that in a minute, you have such a gift for description and such a gift for putting somebody into the moment. So tell me a little bit about yourself as a writer in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the compliment. So I spent about 20 years, maybe 25 now. You can tell from the shades of gray, I've been around.
A wisdom. You've earned your crown.
Thank you. So I spent some time as a feature writer for The Nation and later The Standard.
And The Nation and The Standard are Kenya's biggest newspapers, largest selling daily newspapers.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I was also the critic for The Arts. So I was already getting into books, reading and reviewing books, talking to writers. So what I can say is that my time in the newsroom helped refine my craft because there are two useful benefits that I picked from journalism, and one of them is deadlines. I mean, you have to have a story delivered on time for it to be published. So I spent my early life in journalism. So I bring that particular skill to my writing. But also I would say, although I didn't publish until 2002, I had been a journalist for 15 years earlier. So that allowed the development of my craft, because by writing constantly, writing virtually every week, or maybe several times each week, I was able to refine my craft. Yeah. So the ability to be absorbed in a moment, observe patiently, and be able to reenact that, I think it's something that comes with practice. So I think those intersections, journalism and creative writing, feed off each other. Because when I was in the newsroom, my features were distinct because I wrote differently. As a creative writer, you'll be able to get a little more texture to a person, to a situation, to a development. And so those two have been, complementary skills that I was fortunate to practice and publish for a while.
And indeed, if anybody's interested in looking at some of the journalistic pieces, you have a website where people can go and get and I know exactly what you mean, that you can take a moment and then stretch out that moment and fill it with things that just take you into a particular place. One of my favorite stories is on that, which you can find on, I think it's www.peterkimani.com, am I right? And you have this moment where you capture a school trip. And it's so wonderful because you take us into childhood. And indeed, Peter, before you got known for Dance of the Jacaranda and your other novel, which we'll talk about a little bit, you wrote for children. You became, actually, Kenyans, I think, know you as an award-winning writer. And you actually won the Jomo Kenyatta Award, which is the highest literary honor that Kenya can give a book, for a children's book. Could you tell us a little bit more about that children's book?
Well, it was one of the most difficult assignments, I must admit.
Yeah.
Because you have to inhabit the mind of a child.
Yes.
And as an adult, trying to do that wasn't very easy. But I was commissioned by my local publisher, Oxford University Press. This was in the aftermath of post-election challenges that we faced some 13 years ago. when you had a dispute between two political, actors, and there was violence in which more than 1,000 people were killed. And I was told to write a story explaining this violence from the perspective of a child. So I tried to explain Kenya's cultural mosaic, or the political turmoil from the eyes of an 11-year-old girl. So in a sense, I am always unconsciously interested in history, because even through this narrative of an 11-year-old, I am revisiting the question: what does it mean to be Kenyan, and how does ethnicity, which has been the ogre that has reared its head from time to time, how do you explain that to a child who doesn't even understand a language, or a language as one of the manifestations of her or his origin. So it was a very difficult assignment. I wrote without knowing I was doing better than most writers for that year, because Jomo Kenyatta Literary Prize was pretty meaningful. But I tried to exercise that demon of ethnicity, because children with their innocence are corrupted by adults. So we are not raising our children properly if they turn into adults who have these warped ideas about who they are. So you can possibly say this children's book in a way did inform the Jakaranda, ultimately Dance of the Jakaranda, when I wrote it, because it does expound from a different perspective in a different context what it means to be Kenyan.
Yeah.
Right.
And indeed that connection, which I'm glad you've made, that you it's this thing of being able to look at history, this thing of being able to look at realities, but retell them in a way that captures them and makes you think about them and look at them in a completely different lens. And I think it's actually very difficult to write for children, especially when you're dealing with these kind of matters. And the fact that you captured that so well. The book is called Upside Down, for anybody who wants to look it up. But it's an excellent view into a very difficult subject matter, but for young minds. And I think that was an excellent job. You also have another novel, Before the Rooster Crows. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that one before we come to the main one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Before the Rooster Crows came out in 2002. It was my first novel. One can say, just like parenthood, that your firstborn is your most difficult, but also the most joyous experience. So you write from complete immersion and complete devotion to the material. So it's a book I wrote with a lot of love. And when I was looking at it again, I thought there were interesting connections between the Jacaranda and the rooster, because it also explores the question of race and exploitation. Although it is framed simply as a rural to urban kind of divide, or the journey between this village and this city, the protagonist is also dealing with history. And so the crux of this story, if I may share, the inspiration for it was actually a historical event. So I think August 1980, an American Marine arrives in Mombasa, picks up a local woman. Actually, this was the second woman for the night, and they have an argument and over pay, and he murders this woman in cold blood. And the man is sentenced to what they call, he was given probation. He wasn't jailed, and he was fined the equivalent of $5, same amount as what he had stolen from this woman. So what I do with this story is to revisit the history and make some amends, at least from my fictional narrative. Right some wrong because when I read this story in the 90s, I was totally outraged as a Kenyan that this young woman was basically traded away by her country, by her people, to the foreign gods, whatever American relations have been to Kenya. So I am interested in the idea of confronting our past and rewriting that past, not to enact historical revisionism, but to employ artistic license to imagine a different possibility or a different future for the characters involved. So you can say what I've been doing is what Chinua Achebe called restoring.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I find it's interesting when you talk about your work that we see, Toni Morrison, who talked about writing the book that you wanted to read. And you seem to do something really interesting, which is to go into history and to look at, we often look at the stories of the big people and, this grand narrative. And you've got a way of reading a moment and looking at the diversity, first of all, of society, and looking at how that moment, what that moment was like, what it meant to people over a range of different life experiences, and particularly the issue of race, which Kenyans generally would say, race isn't something that, we're really bothered about. We've got ethnicity is more of an issue. And I like the way you go in and you say, actually, no, let's think about that and let's see what is happening and what we can do about that. I seem to have lost Peter a little bit. But as we wait to get him back, I'm just going to perhaps just give a sense of, so what you see in those three books, whether it is Before the Rooster Crows, Dance of the Jacaranda, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in a few minutes, and the third book, which is Upside Down, is that sense of reading this moment, read a moment, and then build on that moment and see where it takes us. What I'm going to do then, as we wait to get Peter, I think we may have a problem and have lost him on the line, is I'm going to just do a reading of the next, just a little bit more of a reading from his book. And this is the passage, I think, that gives you a little bit more when we talk about being able to capture the history. And so, as you remember, we had left it when our key character, or one of our characters, Master, is looking back, and then he's starting to think a little bit more about what's happening. And while we wait to get Peter on the line, let me just read a few more lines from that passage. The mass of water appeared to have grown from a pond into a large lake. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. Or maybe after crawling through that very same land on either donkey or zebra, his lofty perch on the train now afforded him a very different view. To the left, a spring spewed hot water, the vapor casting clouds on woolly nothingness above it. One of these should be named for Sally, Master thought, the ideas eliciting a melange of soreness and softness that always came from the memories of his English wife, now estranged for 4 years. She was the reason he was looking forward to returning to England. A ship was waiting at the port of Mombasa, some 500 miles away, where the rail construction had begun. The railroad tracks ended at the head of what he had named Port Victoria, memorializing the lake there with the same name in honor of the Queen of England. So, the rail that started by the shores of the Indian Ocean now cut through the hinterland to the shores of Lake Victoria. This was the mission that had brought him to the British East Africa Protectorate, and it had been accomplished. He had been discharged with full honor, the cable from London said, echoing the military jargon that had regulated his life for 23 years. The cable also said a letter with the full details of his release had been dispatched on SS Britannia, the vessel that would deliver him home to England. Master suppressed a smile at the thought, and further subverted the thought by pretending to scratch his pate, whose receding hairline merged with his forehead to form what looked like a small crater. Happy are the pure in heart, Reverend Richard Turnbull, sitting beside Master, said over the rattling sounds of the train. Kukuru kakara, kukuru kakara. That was one of my favorite passages, and I'm really glad that Peter gave me the chance to get there, because it captures what he was talking about, the way he captures the sound of the train. Kukuru kakara, kukuru kakara. Peter, we were just doing a little bit more of that reading while we waited to get you back now, and so we can continue our conversation. One more thing before we dive into Dance of the Jacaranda, which I thought might be of interest. You're also a poet, and you've got a very, very famous poem out there. Do you want to say just a little bit about that before we go on to the rest of now to talk about Dance of the Jacaranda?
Sure. And apologies for my weird power disruption. That's a typical Nairobi challenge. It's back. I hope it will last. So I better speak quickly before it goes off again. Anyway, my invitation by the Americas, NPR radio contacted me and said, Obama has Kenyan roots. You're a poet. Can you write something for his inauguration? So we were 3 poets, 2 others, I think, from Europe, and I was invited to write from Kenya. So we delivered this on NPR on the day of his inauguration. So it was specifically written for him. So I didn't get to perform it in Washington, but it was aired across America on that morning of inauguration. So I tried to capture the spirit of his roots and what those who went ahead of him, his father, his ancestors, may have looked back on this moment and what a triumph it was. So yeah, it is an ode to Obama, from a Kenyan to a fellow Kenyan, especially if you believe Donald Trump, who believes Obama was born in Kenya.
Yeah, well, our cousin Barack, but I'm happy to see that you're writing about history, whether it's happening in the moment or history from the past. And with that, I'd like us to just talk a little bit about Dance of the Jacaranda. Dance of the Jacaranda was selected as a New York Times editor choice, and I think that the reviewer Fiametta Rocco really captured the book, the essence of the book. So I'm going to ask you to perhaps select a passage, a different passage from what I read. And as I do that, let me just share a couple. I think it's one line, which I think she just captures she summarizes well what the book is. Dance of the Jacaranda is set both in the 1960s at the time of Kenyan independence and at the end of the 19th century, during the scramble for Africa, the historic race that brought Black, white, and brown people together to cut a 600-mile line of mostly single-track railway linking Lake Victoria and the headwaters of the Nile with the Indian Ocean at Mombasa, which is the passage that I have just read. Peter, would you like to give us a little bit more of the book, a sense of the book?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to read from a segment in the 1960s. This is just on the onset of independence. So there are those 2 time frames, 60s and 1900s and 1890s. So this is going to be inside the Jacaranda. This is the establishment called the Jacaranda, and the main protagonist, Rajan, is performing there, as he normally does every few nights each week. He walked up to the microphone on stage and adjusted it to his height. He was small-bodied, like a stunted teen, with a clutch of jet black hair held at the back by a red, gold, and green hairband. When fans saw him for the first time, they often remarked that fame does not match its owner, for his frame came up short of his towering reputation. The instruments were building in tempo. Rajan trembled with delight and nodded appreciatively to the instrumentalists, tapping his right foot, responding to a rhythm that appeared to bubble deep inside him. In his formative years as a singer, Rajan would shake with fright before the curtains opened, unsure how the audience might respond. Sometimes, lines that he had rehearsed for weeks would evaporate at the sight of hundreds of eyes. Now, he was a lot more composed, but the dread of performing a show never really left him. It helped when he was under the influence of something. Steam is what they called pre-concert intoxication. He had had a few beers to unlock his mind. Rajan let the instruments play on, the squeak from the keyboard, the wail of the guitar, and the throb of the drums building into a frenzy. He yanked the microphone from its stand and walked to the edge of the platform as hundreds of hands rushed to touch him. He crooned in a low, mournful voice. Baruana kutumia, nikufunze ya dunia, usije ukaangamia, ewe wangwe, ewe nawe, uwe wangwe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm so happy that we got to get that sense and the song, which is, of course, a very famous song. Any Kenyans who are listening, of course, know that that's Fadili Williams. And you sing so well. I did not know that. I knew you wrote well. I didn't know you sang well. So this book is really about it's multi-generational, multiracial. You've introduced us to Rajan. I talked a little bit at the beginning about this master who is this administrator who had been, given the task of getting the railway done. And in that train, we knew that they were European, British, they were Indian, Asian, and then they were African, of all the different ethnicities on that train. And then you're taking us through this family generations around the story of three men and the women that they loved. Could you help me unravel all of that? How do we link this man in the train at the beginning with this young man who's singing this beautiful song in the passage that you've read?
Right. Yeah, so the Jakaranda is interested in many large historical themes. Could be race and identity, could be exploitation and redemption, could be love and hate. There is a huge corpus of themes, but all these have to be told through human interactions. And at a very basic level, the story level is what drives the story. So I found as I try to examine my possibilities, I found the railway line or the railway construction to be a very useful device, because it was a neat intersection of all these issues I wanted to bring together. In that, the train or the construction of the train or the railway line is what opens up the country for exploitation. Some say for modernization, depending on who is talking. And through it, you see it tears through the land, destroying cultures and histories, getting people coerced to cooperate, or lured to the colonial enterprise. You see even other conquered lands, like the Indians were brought from India, and these were mainly from the Punjab. Another level of exploitation, because they too are colonial subjects. Yeah. So what I found the train to manifest was you have all these men and women, mainly men, black and brown and white, joining hands to put something together. But even this unity and solidarity replicates the divisions, because the train has compartments, and these compartments reflect the what will become the colonial policy of segregation, You have settlements for whites, for Indians, you have settlements for blacks. So it's a neat metaphor for the, you can say this was a petri dish that the book is saying this is going to be largely applied to the colony, the segregation, the divisions. So we know suffrage, labor, or even residence was assigned according to race. So I was interested in that particular narrative, but I was also interested in oral histories because we had local seers, prophets and prophetesses who had foreseen the coming of the white man. And oral narratives, to me, lie at the heart of this story by challenging the colonial archive, or what's documented to be the true record of our history. So I have a drummer, Nyundo, who is drumming. We know the drum to be, a carryover from centuries of history because it was a coded message, as well as transmission of knowledge to one group to another. So we can see the train construction manages to bring all these people together to one enterprise. While still, talking closely or intimately to the kind of disruption that the train enacts. So when it is recorded, in the colonial archives, how the construction meant to the British, nobody asks what it meant to the locals. So here I am trying to, in other words, to challenge the privileging of the written history, to say we have oral histories as well, and they have been the embodiment of our past. And that's why you see, if you read The Shape of the Story, enacts the fireside experience, the fireside storytelling experience, where you don't have one main track or one main protagonist narrating a story. You have one passing on to the next and the next and the next, which is what traditional oral African storytelling was about. So we can say I was trying to perform a few things, retell the African story, or the construction of the railway as told by Africans, but also resurrect those histories that have been buried under the heap of colonial distortions and pure fiction.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've said so many wonderful things, that the idea of that metaphor, the train, and what the disruption it causes. And you see it not only in terms of the train and causing disruption to these groups of people, but also to individual lives. And the idea also of how relatable, because what you do is you're telling us the story. It's first of all a very easy book to read. It's also very funny in parts. When you talk about these big, heavy issues, the books become very serious and very much caught up in grief. And this book is so much fun to read that you're laughing out loud, you're enjoying the story as it goes. But I also love the fact that you see events from different people's perspectives. So you see the train from the perspective of the man inside it, but also from the people who are I'm looking after my livestock, and they go off in different directions. And in your story, you have these three men who are white and who are privileged. So these are the elite. Two men in particular, the missionary and this guy who came to build the railway. And then you have this Indian man who also came to build the railway, but whose story we often in Kenya, we don't really think about who else came. We just say they came to build the railway, they were laborers. But you introduce us to Babu, and Babu becomes a really important person in this story. And then we go through the generations, and almost on the margins are the Africans. And then as the story gets told, you start to see the shift, so that at the end, the Africans are very much at the center of the story. And these European colonizers who came are very much at the periphery of the story. And I really love the way you enable us to see that. Would you like to talk about the characters? And I'm really interested also in the fact that it seems so male-centered, and yet the women also are very much the mystery. These mysterious loves, if that's the way I think about them, very much drive the story. So let's talk a little bit about the characters.
Sure. Okay, yeah, so a few things. So I remember the question I was faced with by friends who read this book. Initially, they were asking, you can't have a story of Africans without a story of Africa without Africans. But I said it's also metaphorical in this sense that we've been, for 100 years, we've been passive witnesses to our history. And then I also, respond by saying, the exploration of the Indian was to challenge the binary, black and white issues, black and white struggles, to say there is a brown shade as well, the gray matter, the gray area. And I thought identity is a totally complex and getting complicated as we get more and more globalized. And then the other point I wanted to make very briefly is that although the train refers to the past, when it came out in 2017 was also the present, because that's the time when the Chinese were inaugurating their new rail, almost following the same track that we had challenged or I had challenged in my narrative, almost repeating the same mistakes that we were talking of 100 years. Because you see, the metaphorical train or the metaphorical rail was the serpent, or a giant snake that swallows all that the land can produce and ships it away. And that's exactly what the Chinese are doing. We are saddled in debt, worse than we have ever been in our 50 something years of history. So the past is not the past. It is the present, because those challenges are very present with us. So the characters, I would say, evolved organically, and although men appear to be at the center of it, women actually drive this narrative, because it's, for instance, it's Marian who connects Rajan, Babu, and Master and the preacher. They're all connected through her lineage. So you can even think of Sally, another woman that McDonald has very complex relationship with, and he is almost enslaved by her. He all his life pursuits are endeavored towards pleasing her. So and you can also talk of Fatima and very complex relationship with Babu. So you can see the women are positioned on the fringe, but they enact very key moments in the story, which lead us to appreciate the overall importance. Remember, this is 19th century Victorian history. I'm rewriting. So men of course were the ones who were sent abroad, and women are not given very prominent roles. But I do utilize them to subvert masculinity. And challenge those very well established norms in patriarchal and things like that. So my characters are, of course, multi-generational. So I had one historical hero that I wanted to revive in this story. I don't know if you're familiar with Makan Singh, but Makan Singh is was my loose inspiration for Babu, a trade unionist who is very committed to the cause of liberation of his country, his adopted country. It's multi-generational presentation.
He talks about multi-generational. I love that.
So that's Samora. He loves coming to Spring Surprises. So my characters are, even when they are inspired by historical figures, they are fictional, because I complicate them beyond what we know of one particular historical figure. You have Rajan, who is a musician, but I think it's interesting, even when the story came out and Rajan is left stranded at this no man's land, at the airport, we had a citizen of this country left in the same space. So the idea of writing about the rail as a preoccupation with history, I am actually saying we haven't quite exercised our past. There are lots of things we need to deal with for us to appreciate each other and the unique position and unique moment in our collective. So Rajan, of course, is a very interesting young man. I have no particular favorite. I think all of them do intrigue me, especially as they grow in the book. But one of my favorites is Nyundo, because Nyundo was dead in a few drafts. So he was dead for a few years as the book went into its making, until he insisted on his life. And Nyundo, after coming to revise the book, came to symbolize burial and resurrection of African memory, which is what the story is really about. So you see these characters reveal their purpose, reveal their life. If one is, listening intently, the characters can teach how the writer can write them.
I'm just going to say, I love the way that off the top of my head, I could think of 3 or 4 other historical figures from the whole, building this monument of love to the whole political figures. And I love the way that, so Rajan is Babu's is Babu's grandson. But I love the way that as the story travels through generation, it picks up the history of that generation. So you can literally teach the history of Kenya or look at the way Africa evolves through multiple decades through the lives of this story. And one thing I absolutely love about Rajan is when he climbs on stage and he's going to sing, I'm expecting him to sing something that speaks to his heritage as coming from India. And then he sings this quintessential Kenyan song. And I'm like, that is who Rajan is. Just as you said about Makan Singh, that you stop seeing him in terms of his racial ancestry. I have a question, actually a comment and a question from Nyagudi Chege. And she says, I really love the story as told through the eyes of Babu and by extension, the Indian community and their role in the creation of Kenya. The multiple layers to him and his story, from the laborer to the secret freedom fighter, was fascinating. I can't wait for the stories to be told about the construction of the SGR, which is the railway, the standard gauge railway that you were referring to, that has just been completed, and all the other infrastructure, Chinese-funded projects. What would you say today that seems to suggest that our writers and poets and historians are beginning to tell these stories? What do you see today that seems to suggest that we are now beginning to tell these stories?
Well, because we are telling those stories. That's a simple answer. I think what I can say is that every generation has to define its issues, its causes. So we had the 60s and 70s. It was a post-coloniality that our predecessors were dealing with, Ngugi's generation. You have the urban phenomenon that Mshai Mwangola explored. So I think for us, maybe it's a question of identity, and this seems to be undying because through even the previous decades, you can say we haven't truly formulated who we truly are. And I think the insistence on one particular identity is what's constricting us, that we should be celebrating the 46 and counting national histories that all form this mosaic that we call Kenya. And there should be no privileging of one particular story over others. So I was thinking if one were to look at the Indian, it's interesting actually. When my book came out, the same year, the December of that year, or maybe June 1st, Madaraka Day, they were recognized as the 44th tribe of this country, and I think part of the unspoken desire in the story is to acknowledge or at least register the validity of this community as part of the Kenyan collective. So even when I was being asked, how can you write about a story of Kenya without Kenyans? But Indians are part of that collective. And I think you know, every generation will have to define its own causes, you know, challenge those issues. And then you have continuities in the sense that even as we talk of the railway as a historical phenomenon, we have to think about contemporary challenges that emanate from the way our economic and social and political developmental trajectories were all built on the same tracks. So what I mean is the townships that emerged, the future townships in this country, evolved from the small stations that were built on the railway line. So it took 2007 crisis for us to recognize devolution was a meaningful intervention. Every Kenyan needs to feel they have a stake in our collective future. So a place like the Northeastern province did not have an inch of tarmac. I was a journalist, I went to those parts of this country, did not have an inch of tarmac until they discovered oil in Turkana. So again, we're perpetuating the same colonial mentality that unless you can extract something from the land, unless you can steal something from the land or the people to whom it belongs, you've got no interest in fostering development in those parts. So put another way, our 56 years of history have not gone away from the railway line. So until we got devolution, that's when we started thinking of other parts of the country that deserved development. And for us to feel secure and for the nation to prosper, we all have to have a stake in our collective future. So even as we think of you know, contemporary issues, we have continuities that we haven't quite resolved from our past.
You know, I wanted to ask you as the closing question, why historical fiction is important. Why don't we just talk about the present? Because most African writers focus on the present, quite a few also look into the past. I think you've completely answered that question. So instead, I'm going to make my final question to you about this book, which is one of my absolute favorite books. It's a book that you have chosen to edit. I'm showing it up because this is the Nairobi cover. We have a very special cover. If you're not in Nairobi, you get another cover. But the reason I wanted to finish by talking about, asking you to say a word about Nairobi Noir. This is a series, it's an anthology of stories about Nairobi and mostly really set in the present. And it occurs to me when I think about what you're talking about, history and the way that fiction enables us to grapple with all these big questions, and the way that this idea of multiplicity of perspectives helps us to understand them. I couldn't imagine anybody who would have been better placed to edit this book, and that shows us another thing that you're doing. Could you just say something about Nairobi Noir, please?
Sure. And thanks, Mshai. Well, it was another challenge thrown to me by my publisher. So they love throwing challenges to me. I didn't know until I was done that they had commissioned other editors, maybe 2 or 3 other editors previously, and they couldn't hack it. So again, when I was requested to put together an anthology of stories, to celebrate Nairobi and also to put the map on Nairobi, put Nairobi on the map, literally. I knew I wanted to review or excavate the past because, I mean, the idea of the genre itself, noir, is that, Nairobi is a natural noir story because the
when you said celebrate and Nairobi noir, I was like, what?
Yes. Yeah, Nairobi, dispossessed from the Maasai using some dubious treaties, 1904 and 1911. So what better space to examine the idea of Noah than a city that was founded on such a premise? But I wanted to go beyond that and say we have very, very complex. We have a very complex society. And now class is a new race. So no one is going to prevent you from inhabiting certain parts of the city, but you see a reenactment of the same divisions. They are no longer racial, now they're economic. How do we navigate as human beings when we are in a very dehumanizing condition? So by getting stories that were going to be inspired by the everyday life of ordinary Kenyans. So I was very fortunate to get, writers from all walks of life, experienced, like Ngoge, who is in his 80s, to Troy Onyango, who is in his 20s, several generations of Kenyan writers in one anthology. Is a real feast just for us to appreciate where our writing is coming from and where it seems to be going, and what connects us between these generations. So Yagodi's question about each generation having their issues appear to be fused in Nairobi Noah, because you can weave a tapestry that's connecting through. There is a thread that can neatly connect. Ngugi's exploration of religion and what a crooked policeman is doing, each trying to earn a living, or a little boy being lured into some illegal gang in Kariobangi. There is the dehumanization, and what keeps these people going is monument to our shared humanity. So wherever the context, each is trying to survive, and I think in to return to where we started, in a sense, all these themes are unified by, at story level, you see we're invested in the pursuits of all these characters, big and small, as they navigate life, and hopefully we'll reveal something true about our existence as humans in this part of the world.
Yeah. Peter, I could keep on talking to you for hours. I mean, there's so much to unpack also in that book, but I really appreciate that you've been able to just show how in all your work, you're really grappling with the same questions from multiple ways of entering. And even in this work that you edit, and by editing, you generously provide a space and host a whole group of writers from some of Kenya's best known writers, like, as you mentioned, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Makena Onjerika, who won the Kane Prize, to new writers, people who are writing for the very, very first time. And you bring them all into this conversation of history, on multi-perspectives, on questions about race, because that's another conversation that the book is putting on the table, and all linked into the concerns of the present. In the words of Kinyanjui Kombani, who is on this, who's just written to say, thank you for an absolutely great conversation. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. You're going to make me go back and read all the work again, because I really now want to read it with those insights. And I just thank Columbia Global Centers for giving us this opportunity to begin to explore your work. And I hope that everybody who does get to listen to this conversation will similarly pick up Dance of the Jacaranda, Nairobi Noir, Before the Rooster Crows, or Upside Down, or look you up on your website, www.peterkimani.org, .com, and just get to know your work better.
peterkimani.co.ke. But you've done enough marketing. You don't need to worry about the website.
No, because I just really have enjoyed talking to you and exploring your work. Yeah. Thank you very much, Columbia Global Centers, for giving us this opportunity.
It's my pleasure. It's my immense pleasure, Mshai. Really good to see you again and to converse. And thanks to our audience and for their questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for joining us today as we kicked off this book series. You will agree that this was incredibly interesting and enlightening. We hope you have learned a thing or two from the work of author Peter Kimani. We owe our gratitude to Dr. Peter Kimani and Dr. Mshai Mwangola for leading such a dynamic session. We hope you will join us for the next book in this series, The Dragonfly Sea by Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor. Please look out for the announcement. We wish you a pleasant evening or day ahead, wherever you may be. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, Pauline.
All right.
And thanks, everyone.